Somerleyton Road, Brixton, South London, a Tuesday morning in September 1958, 7:20. Ted Harrow, 6 years on the Brixton delivery round, had the airmail envelope for number 34 sorted into his right hand before he reached the step the way. He sorted every envelope for that address before he reached it. Number 34 was a house divided into 8 rooms, 8 families sharing one letterbox. And on a good week, that letterbox took 11 or 12 airmail envelopes, bordered in the diagonal red and blue stripes that marked a letter as having crossed an ocean by aeroplane rather than by ship. Ted Harrow could tell the Jamaica envelopes from the Barbados ones by the stamps before he read a word of the address. He had learned this without meaning to. What he had not learned in 6 years of putting these envelopes through this letterbox was what was folded inside most of them alongside the letter. A thin paper document, cashable at any post office counter, that the post office itself called a postal order, and the people inside number 34 called something closer to a lifeline. Ted Harrow's Brixton round had grown steadily heavier across those 6 years, not because the street had grown longer, but because the number of households at each address had grown denser. Post office staff instructions from this period record a documented rise in delivery volume on rounds serving areas of high multiple occupancy, a pattern directly tied to post-war housing shortage and the settlement of new Commonwealth arrivals in specific London districts. Ted Harrow did not know the history behind why number 34 took 11 or 12 airmail envelopes, where a comparable house on a different street took none. He knew only the weight of his bag on a Tuesday, and the particular care with which he sorted this address before every other one on the round. What was a man in a rented room in Brixton sending home, every fortnight, inside an envelope that cost him a morning's wages to post? And what was the letter that came back, doing 3 or 4 weeks later, that the money inside the first one could not do on its own? The airmail letter that Ted Harrow put through the door at number 34 had already travelled a specific, documented route before it reached Brixton. A letter, posted in a pillar box in Kingston, Jamaica, was collected and sorted at the General Post Office on King Street, rebuilt there after the 1907 earthquake, and still the island's central sorting point in the 1950s, decades before Jamaica's automated central sorting office opened in 1980. From King Street, the letter was routed for the transatlantic airmail service, and from London's own sorting offices, it was distributed onward by the ordinary daily round the same red pillar boxes, the same sorting frames, the same postmen who sorted every other letter in the country. Documented airmail rate and routing records from this period confirm that London to Kingston airmail typically took between 1 and 2 weeks in the 1950s, improving as air routes expanded through the 1960s. The reply took the same length of time in reverse. A complete exchange, a question asked and answered, could run to a month. Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you've been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of the Royal Mail between 1900 and 1980. The vehicle, the round, the sorting office, and the letter that the system carried. Not nostalgia for red vans. The documented operational reality of a postal system, and the specific human meaning of what it delivered before the telephone changed what it meant to wait for news. What Winston Facey folded into an airmail envelope to a mother in rural Jamaica was not romance about a lost art of letter writing. It was 3 months of overtime, a fortnight's homesickness, and the only proof in a hostile winter city that the sacrifice had been worth it. And if you remember these letters, or wrote them, or waited for them, put it in the comments. If your family sent or received letters between the Caribbean and Britain in these years, tell us where they travelled and who was waiting at the other end. Next, the sorting office at Mount Pleasant. On the night the Christmas mail from the whole of the Caribbean diaspora in Britain arrived at once. What the airmail system could move in 1 to 2 weeks, it could not compress any further. What it required of the people at both ends of the route, the writer in Brixton, the reader in Jamaica, is the part the timetable does not record. Winston Facey wrote his letters on Sunday evenings. The only evening London Transport did not have him on a late shift. He wrote at the small table in his one room at number 34, the paraffin heater going because the landlord did not supply enough coal for 8 households from 1 metre, and he wrote in the same order every fortnight. First the money, how much was enclosed. As a postal order, cashable at the post office, in the market town, nearest his mother's house. Then the work, then the weather. And last, briefly, how he was managing. Documented Caribbean migrant correspondence, collected by researchers gathering Windrush generation family letters, follows this same practical sequence with striking consistency. Money first, then circumstance, then a final line about well-being that migrants across the community understood as a kind of code brief by design, reassuring by intention, and rarely a full account of what the winter, the work, and the welcome had actually been like. The reassurance was doing a specific job. A worried letter home invited a worried reply, and a worried reply could invite a mother's insistence that her son come back, an outcome the economics of the household in Jamaica could not afford. So, the letter reported adequacy. The postal order proved it. And the gap between what the letter said and what the sender's actual week had contained was carried silently, week after week, by the writer alone. This was not a private eccentricity of Winston Facey's. Documented Windrush-era correspondence, gathered by archival researchers, describes the same fortnightly discipline repeated across thousands of households, a rhythm imposed less by postal timetables than by the emotional economics of migration itself. To miss a fortnight without explanation was, within these communities, understood as a kind of alarm in itself, regardless of what had actually happened that week. The letter's regularity was doing work independent of its content. What did it cost a man to write, "I am managing well," in a letter home, in a country that had made every public and private effort to tell him he was not welcome and did not belong? And what did his mother, 3,000 miles away, actually understand from a letter written in that code? Icilda Ferguson walked 2 miles into the district post office every second Friday, the day the mailbag from Kingston was due, and she had been doing this since her son Winston left for England in 1956. She did not need the postmistress to tell her whether a letter had come. She could see it in whether the woman reached under the counter without being asked. Rural Jamaican post offices in this period served scattered farming districts, where many families had no daily contact with the postal system at all, beyond the twice-weekly collection day, a pattern documented in Post and Telecommunications Department, historical records as the standard rural service. Through the 1950s and 1960s, decades before the island's rural network was substantially modernized. Icilda Ferguson had learned to read past the reassurance in her son's letters, the way every mother on that collection day queue had learnt to. She counted the pages. She weighed the envelope in her hand before she opened it, the way Winston weighed hers. 2 pages and a postal order folded inside meant a good fortnight. 1 page and no postal order meant a bad one, whatever the closing line said. This was not suspicion, it was, eventually, a mother learning her son's handwriting under pressure, and without it, a form of reading that had nothing to do with literacy and everything to do with knowing a person well enough to read the letter he had not written. Every second Friday, she was not alone in this practice. The collection day queue at the district post office was, in effect, a gathering of mothers, wives, and fathers, performing the same silent arithmetic on their own envelopes before they had even broken the seal. A documented social pattern at rural Caribbean sub-post offices across the migration period, where the twice-weekly mailbag arrival organized not just postal collection, but a recurring point of shared, unspoken vigil for an entire district. What was the postal order actually carrying, beyond its printed value in shillings and pence? And what happened to a family's understanding of a son's life in England, when the money arrived reliably, but the truth of the winter, the work, and the welcome did not? The postal order was not simply money. It was documented evidence, converted into a form a rural Jamaican post office could cash, of a specific set of facts. The letter itself was reluctant to state directly. The 12-hour shift, the cold, no one had adequately described to him before he left Kingston. The landlord who divided a 6-room house into 8 lettings and called it lodging. The bus conductor's uniform, worn through a London winter by a man who had never before needed one. Caribbean migrants in this period worked disproportionately in transport, the health service, and manual labor that filled a documented post-war shortage, the National Health Service, recruiting heavily from the Caribbean to address a shortfall of tens of thousands of nursing posts. The postal order, cashed at a rural post office counter, converted 12-hour shifts on a London bus route into a roof repair, a school fee, a debt paid off before the harvest. This was the letter's second job, running underneath the reassuring first one. It converted absence into something usable. It made the sacrifice legible in the one currency a family 3,000 miles away could actually spend. Rural Jamaican households, receiving these postal orders, often used them for specific, documented purposes, recorded in oral history collections of the period. School fees paid termly rather than annually, because a fortnightly postal order made monthly budgeting more realistic than lump sum saving. Corrugated roofing sheets bought a few at a time as money allowed, and small parcels of land purchased outright once enough postal orders had accumulated across several years of a son's or daughter's absence. The postal order was not a single transaction. It was a slow, cumulative rebuilding of a family's material position, fortnight by fortnight, at the price of the sender's presence. If the money proved the sacrifice was worthwhile, what proved that the sacrifice was survivable? What, in a letter that could not say directly what Brixton in 1958 was actually like, told a mother in rural Jamaica that her son was not just providing, but managing? The letter that arrived at number 34 did not stay private for long. Caribbean households in 1950s, Brixton and Notting Hill were frequently multiple occupancy, 8 or 10 adults sharing kitchens, staircases, and a single street door, and letters from home moved through those houses, the way news always had in the communities the tenants had left behind. Read aloud, passed hand to hand, discussed on the landing. A letter reporting a wedding, a death, or news of who else in the district was preparing to travel did not belong only to its addressee. It belonged, within hours, to the house, and often to the wider network of countrymen and women who had settled nearby, specifically so that this kind of shared life could continue. This was not incidental to the letter's function, it was central to it. Housing discrimination in this period was severe, and well-documented landlords across London routinely refused black tenants outright. And the exact wording that appeared on rental notices in these years has been recorded in multiple historical archives as a blunt refusal on the grounds of race. Caribbean communities in Britain responded, in part, by concentrating in specific streets and buildings, which meant that a letter delivered to one address effectively reached a much wider audience than its envelope suggested. The postal system, without any intention of doing so, was distributing news to a community that the housing market had pushed together. Churches, savings clubs, and informal community networks in Brixton and Notting Hill grew directly out of this concentration, and letters were frequently the first piece of information that circulated through them. News of a new arrival needing a room, a wedding requiring a collection, a family in Jamaica or Trinidad facing hardship that the wider community might help address. The letter's route did not end at its addressee. It continued, informally, through exactly the social structures that housing discrimination had inadvertently created. What did it mean for a letter to be, simultaneously, a private message and a piece of community news? And what happened when the news inside an envelope was not good? Not every letter arrived on schedule, and not every letter arrived at all. Airmail postage was a real cost, against a working wage priced by weight, at a rate that made a longer letter a considered expense rather than a casual one, and a postal order sent inside an ordinary, unregistered envelope carried a real risk of loss in transit, a risk documented in period post office correspondence and complaints records on both sides of the Atlantic. For a family that had built a fortnight's expectations around a specific collection day, a letter that did not arrive was rarely read as an ordinary postal delay. It was read, first, as the worst version of events, because there was no faster way to check. The letter, as a medium, had a structural limitation that no amount of care in the writing could remove. It could not communicate urgency without resorting to a telegram, an expense reserved for genuine emergencies, and it could not carry tone of voice. A shaking hand, a delayed reply, a shorter than usual letter. These were the only signals available to a reader 3,000 miles away, and they were frequently misread in both directions for the simple reason that a letter can describe distance but cannot cross it. Some families developed informal protocols to manage this uncertainty. A documented practice among Caribbean migrant communities of this period involved a second, shorter letter sent a week after the main one, specifically to confirm safe arrival of both the previous letter and any enclosed postal order, effectively doubling postage costs to purchase a measure of reassurance the system could not otherwise provide. It was an imperfect solution to a problem the letter, by its nature, could never fully solve. What did families do across the whole period of Caribbean migration to Britain in the days after an expected letter failed to arrive? And what changed from the mid-1970s in how quickly that fear could be resolved? By the mid-1970s, transatlantic telephone calls were becoming available to working households in Britain, expensive, requiring in many cases a trip to a public call box or a neighbour's phone rather than a handset in the hallway, but available in a way they had not been a decade earlier. Caribbean families who had exchanged fortnightly letters for 15 or 20 years began to supplement them with occasional calls, usually reserved for news that could not wait a month: a birth, a death, a decision about whether to send for a child still living with grandparents. Winston Facey made his first call home to Street Elizabeth in 1974 from a call box on Coldharbour Lane, booked in advance through the operator because the connection required it. He heard his mother's voice for the first time in 18 years. What the call gave him was immediate. A question asked and answered in the same conversation. A shaking or a steady voice he could actually hear rather than infer from handwriting. What it did not give him was anything to keep. There was no call folded into a drawer. There was no rereading a conversation on a bad night, the way his mother had reread his letters on hers. What did Icilda Ferguson do with 18 years of her son's letters once the telephone made the fortnightly letter unnecessary? And what did she keep doing on the calls themselves that suggest the letter's function had not actually been replaced, only partly relocated? By the 1980s, the telephone call had largely replaced the letter as the primary means of regular contact between Caribbean families in Britain and relatives at home. And the discipline of the fortnightly letter, the paraffin heater, the Sunday evening at the small table, the postal order folded in, with the news declined across the community as a shared practice. What did not disappear, in a great many households, on both sides of the Atlantic, were the letters that had already been written. They were kept in biscuit tins, in wooden boxes, in drawers the way documents are kept by people who understand, even without being told so directly, that they hold something a phone call never produces: a physical record, in a specific handwriting, of a specific week. That instinct to keep has produced, in recent years, a documented body of research. Archival projects, including recent work by researchers at Birmingham City University collecting Windrush-era family correspondence from across the Caribbean, have located and catalogued letters written between 1948 and the mid-1970s that offer a direct counter-record to the era's dominant press coverage of Caribbean migrants, as, in the words used at the time, a burden on the country they had been invited to rebuild. The letters found in these collections consistently describe hard work, remittance, and resilience, the ordinary, undramatic content of the fortnightly letter, preserved by accident of storage into a form of historical evidence its writers never intended to produce. Researchers involved in this work have described actively appealing to Caribbean communities on both sides of the Atlantic to check exactly the kind of storage Icilda Ferguson used, without ever thinking of it as an archive. The biscuit tin, on a shelf, the box under a bed, because the letters most likely to survive were never the ones written with posterity in mind. They were the ordinary ones, kept for reasons that had nothing to do with history and everything to do with love. What does it mean that the most honest record of the Windrush generation's actual daily life in Britain was never written for historians, but for a mother waiting at a rural post office counter every second Friday? And what happens to that record in households where nobody thought to keep the tin? Winston Facey's mother, Icilda, died in Street Elizabeth in 1989. Among her belongings was a biscuit tin, the pattern on its lid, long, faded, containing letters, postmarked London, Birmingham, and Bristol across 3 decades, some from Winston, some from a daughter who had joined the NHS in Leeds, several with the postal order stub still folded inside, where it had been cached and kept rather than thrown away. If this channel is going to keep documenting what the Royal Mail carried and what it meant to the people who received it, subscribe. There are more rounds, more sorting offices, more letters from active service, more emigrant envelopes that arrived at a door where someone had been going to the window every time the post was due. What Icilda Ferguson kept in that tin was not romance about a lost art of letter writing. It was the only physical record, in a country 3,000 miles from where she raised him, that her son had told the truth about his life in fragments over 30 years, one fortnight at a time. And if you have a letter kept in a drawer or a shoebox, from a father who came on the Windrush, or a mother who followed, later put it in the comments. Tell us who wrote it and who kept it. Next, the sorting office at Mount Pleasant. On the night the Christmas mail from the whole of the Caribbean diaspora in Britain arrived at once. Winston Facey retired from London Transport in 1994, 38 years, after he arrived at Southampton with one suitcase and an address in Brixton he had never seen. He telephoned his sister in Leeds every Sunday by then. He kept his mother's last letters, from 1988 and 1989, in the drawer of a sideboard in his own house in South London. The telephone had not asked him to keep anything. It did not leave anything behind.